It's a pleasure to be able to co-moderate the first online seminar of the Balkan and Eastern Mediterranean Archaeology Program of the Balkan Heritage Foundation and the new Bulgarian University to take place in 2022. I also take pride in being able to introduce to you a person whom I hold in very high regard as a scholar, a teacher, a colleague, and most importantly, a friend. Dr. Kroum Batchvarov is an associate professor of maritime archaeology in the University of Connecticut. He holds his degrees from the Nautical Archaeology Program at Texas A&M University and was a co-director of the first excavation of a post-medieval shipwreck along the Bulgarian coast, the Kitten Shipwreck. He also authored the reconstruction and publication of this archaeological site. Dr. Kroum Batchvarov devised a method for documentation and analysis of the construction of the 17th century Swedish royal ship Vasa and participated in the excavation of the English ship Warwick, wrecked in Bermuda in 1619. He worked on the documentation of shipwrecks in Lake Champlain and the Red River and participated in the excavation of the 15th century shipwreck Gripskunden in Sweden. He is the director of the Rockley Bay Research Project in Trinidad and Tobago, studying the naval battle of Tobago, which took place on March 3rd, 1677. As part of this project, the wreck of a 17th century Dutch warship was discovered, tentatively identified as the 56 gun, and here, please excuse my Dutch, Huis de Groningen. Dr. Batchvarov was one of the co-principal investigators of the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, the largest and most ambitious maritime archaeology expedition ever undertaken, which recorded 64 shipwrecks from the last 25 centuries. Currently, he is completing the reconstruction and publication of a late 9th, early 10th century shipwreck found by Black Sea Map. In 2019 and 2020, Dr. Batchvarov was the Archaeological Institute of America's McCann Taggart Lecturer in Nautical Archaeology. As evident from his biography, Dr. Kroum Batchvarov is an internationally renowned maritime archaeologist who has produced highly acclaimed work with far-reaching impacts. Today, the Balkan Heritage Foundation and the new Bulgarian University have created for us an outstanding opportunity to hear an account on the archaeology of the Kitten Shipwreck from the very person who undertook this groundbreaking work. Furthermore, we will learn about the deep water archaeology of the dozens of fantastically preserved Ottoman period shipwrecks discovered by the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project between 2015 and 2017. As you can probably tell, I'm already very excited to hear this talk and would like to now give the floor to Dr. Kroum Batchvarov.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerbov. I am not sure that this was actually addressed to me. Perhaps there is yet a third Kroum Batchvarov among the Bulgarian archaeological community, so I hardly recognize myself in the superlative terms in which I was described. But thank you very much indeed. It is true that the Kitten Shipwreck was the first completely excavated, documented, reconstructed, and ultimately published shipwreck on the western coast of the Black Sea. Probably on any of the coasts of the Black Sea, it was the first completed Ottoman period wreck. On the one hand side, it is absolutely fabulous to be able to pat yourself on the shoulder and say that you were the first to do something, and that is absolutely delightful from the point of view, let's say, Nova, National Geographic, such absolute stalwarts of perfectly accurate and balanced information such as CNN, Fox News, etc. The problem, however, it is a little more complicated when you're trying to write and to reconstruct this and to write a dissertation and publication on it, and you realize that there is absolutely no comparative material. Then the novelty, the entertainment value of being the first to do something suddenly disappears rather rapidly. Perhaps I will be able to persuade my PowerPoint to work. The Kitten is town, God forbid, almost said village, south of Sozopol on the Bulgarian coast. Although in Bulgarian normally it is spelled, of course, with a single T, I added the T single-handedly because otherwise in the Anglo-Saxon world, the village was pronounced as Kitten. So that is the explanation for my Bulgarian colleagues and friends. This is the southern bay of Kitten. You see the Karagach River, which enters the southern part of the bay and actually does have influence on the preservation of the timber of the Kitten Shipwreck and the other 3 wrecks that we were able to see in this area over here. This part of the pronouncement is a modern jetty that was constructed in the 1980s. And the network over which it is working is representative of an early Bronze Age settlement that the Center for Underwater Archaeology excavated at the time. And off and on continues, I believe, to work on the site. In fact, the early Bronze Age settlement was discovered as a result of the work on the shipwreck. The shipwreck was discovered in the early 1980s, and work was undertaken by the newly formed Center for Underwater Archaeology. At the time, the work was directed by Professor Ktten Shipwreck, who undertook 3 seasons of excavation and published preliminary reports on the site. I'm extremely grateful to Professor Porozhanov for the opportunity to continue the excavation of the site with him in later times. Before I even met Professor Porozhanov, it was Dr. Kalen Dimitrov and the late, much lamented Christina Angelova, who showed me the site together with the other 2 of the 3 wrecks that I have personally seen in the bay. The decision was made, and here, if you allow me, I'll open a parenthesis just in case there are any students who are also part of the audience. I let this lecture be a warning of sorts to you. All my early period, all my student years, and I still keep on repeating it during my career, that my real interests in seafaring are in Dutch and English 17th century shipbuilding. So I suppose it was absolutely inevitable that I will end up best known for my work on Ottoman shipbuilding in the Black Sea. You can see the direct connection, of course. The Kitten Shipwreck is located over here, very close to the jetty, and the construction of the jetty and the heliopad over here in the 1980s certainly had influence on the disturbance of the upper levels of the site. So any of the surface material is of questionable provenience. In fact, the questionable provenience goes deeper into the site, as I will have the opportunity to mention in a moment. Over here, you see our base of operations. It was an old hydrofoil, which no longer exists. I suppose it was long ago cut for scrap, but that was where we were storing our material, and that is from where we worked. The gentleman who is taking a nap here is actually another INA student at the time, Mark Polzer, who was kind enough to join me. Speaking of the dire warnings that I addressed to potential students, let me elaborate slightly on this. When we undertook the excavation, it was based on the assumption that there is only the bow section, this section here of the ship surviving and nothing else. I was told that the vessel was excavated completely. That was before Dr. Porozhanov and I met. I was told that the site had been excavated, all artifacts had been raised, and really, why am I wasting my time with this ship when there is a wonderful Bronze Age settlement right next to it, or as a matter of fact, around it? The ship has sunk in the middle of it, pretty much. I, on the other hand, as beginning archaeology at the start of my career, thought that this is absolutely brilliant. No artifacts to deal with conservation, just house structure to record, which is, after all, my passion. I'm well renowned as having a fetish for rotten, waterlogged wood. What a perfect opportunity, just a little bit of ship reconstruction, ship drawings, publish a short report, and then move on to other things. 4 years later, we realized that in the 1980s, they had had the opportunity to only scratch the surface. In reality, more than 40% of the hull structure survives. The ship is down by the stern, deep down into the bottom. And practically the entire aft, especially here in the stern cabin, lots of artifacts to the tune of about 120 individual catalog numbers were found. This probably is the state at which Dr. Nadim Prakuku, who is online the director of the Center for Underwater Archaeology now, will remember the wreck, since he did me the honor to work with us at the time, for which I'm rather grateful. Very early on, it became clear that this is an extremely interesting site, and it is interesting exactly because of the ship construction. We all know that there are plentiful documents, there are plentiful studies pointing out just how important seafaring and maritime trade was for the Ottoman Empire throughout its existence. But there are, or were at the time, practically no studies of the technical aspects, what these ships look. Sure, there are 17th century and 18th century and even early 19th century drawings, or rather artistic representations of vessels from this period, from the Eastern Mediterranean. But we knew absolutely nothing about their construction. We knew nothing about the way they were put together, the way they were designed. This was the first opportunity to see something like this. So much of the effort, essentially my personal effort, was concentrated on documenting the ship with view of attempting a reconstruction. In this, the gods of archaeologists were certainly on my side, and they provided me with plentiful information with which to work. Early on, we established the master frame of the vessel, which is surviving almost, but not quite, to the deck level. It's probably about a foot 30 or 40 centimeters below deck level. On the left side of the slide here, you see the starboard side of the vessel, actually. And the ship had broken off exactly at the turn of the bilge on the port side, and only the starboard side survives well. At the time of the excavation, as I said, one of the important features that we needed to try to discover was the so-called master frame. The reason behind it is, and I'm like considering how many INA affiliated scholars I saw in the list of participants at the moment, I am preaching to the choir. I'm fully aware of it, and I do beg your pardon most sincerely for repeating obvious things. But the master frame is what essentially dictates the rest of the shape of the vessel through the process known as hull molding, which is gradual modification, developing the shape of the vessel through gradual modification of the central or master frame. In this case, the master frame was very easy to recognize. It is immediately aft of the mast step, the single mast step on the keelson of the vessel. It is a floor timber that is twice the size of all the other framing timbers that you see around it, and has two futtocks or extensions forming the bottom part, the belly of the vessel, if you will, that are attached to both sides of the floor timber. It is completely different from any of the other frames, so it was easy to recognize, to identify. And as I said, further on, luck had a very significant role to play in the ultimate success in the attempt. The timber that we had discovered from the very beginning, the first year, but it was lying, the face of the timber that was lying upwards was so eroded by Teredo navalis or similar wood-eating critters, so heavily damaged, so heavily eroded that it did not look like human has ever worked it. For this reason, we had ignored it and worked around it. By the third season of excavation, however, the timber was really in the way, it needed to be removed. So we lifted it with lift bags, and as two of my colleagues, Petr Petrov and Rumen Železarov, were moving the timber off the side, it rotated in the water column, and I saw the notches on it, and I saw that the protected face had been worked. It proved to be part of the mast partners of the hull. It is the beam that was exactly amidships. There were a couple of very convenient features. Talking about luck here. First of all, because of the location of these notches for carlings, I was able to recover the entire length of the beam, as the beam would be symmetrical here at the top of the crown. And I know the distance from this notch to the end, to the dovetail joint with which the beam connected to the side of the vessel. I was able to determine just how much of the beam is missing on this side. If this was Not enough. On the lower face of the beam, I was able to recognize another notch for a pillars or a stanchion. Fortunately for us, there was only one single such opening on the keelson. Therefore, we knew exactly where the beam originally stayed. There are no other options. This is the only place where it could have been. Why is this important? Well, obviously, because this gave me a way to control the breadth of the ship in the process of reconstruction at this position, at the known position. And that really is the challenge in well-preserved wrecks. The ability to connect, to close in, to draw back in the sides of the vessel. And the beam solved, and this tension step here solved the issue for us. As you can see here on the keelson, you actually can determine the dimensions even of the stanchion, of which absolutely no trace survived. Another interesting feature that this is not really the right place to discuss it, but as the slide is showing it rather well, I would like to point you to bring your attention to it, is the sealing of the bottom of the vessel. It is transversal, and that is the style of sealing that was discovered also on the Serceliman wreck. Here is an isometric drawing of the mast step, the stanchion location, the two sister keelsons that strengthen the mast step, which is actually quite long. It is almost 80 centimeters long, and 4 buttresses that supported it. It is obvious that the master shipwrights were expecting severe stress in that side of the vessel, and this was one of the ways of dealing with it. I'll show you another way of dealing with it a little bit later in the lecture. This is a reconstruction of the midship frame and the midship section of the vessel as it would have existed. The part that survives at the moment, or when we were excavating in the early 20s, is this over here. The rest is, of course, reconstruction or conjecture, if you prefer. The beam, as I mentioned earlier, the length of the beam is giving us the point at which the minimum height to which the side of the vessel would have extended, because this is the earliest point at which we can fare the curve of the side of the vessel with the known breadth of the vessel at this position. Practically very little of the stem survived, only up to the level of the keelson. An interesting feature of the stem is that it is not scarfed to the keel at all. It is simply butted into it with flat butt. And of course, every ship modeler will tell you that this is not possible. They just never build ships like this. No one does. Well, maybe no one does in the ship modeling community, but in the seafaring community of the Mediterranean, quite a few people build vessels like this. There is a tartana found in the central Mediterranean, which has, from Corsica, that has exactly the same butt. Furthermore, the great Ukrainian archaeologist, ship archaeologist, Dr. Dmitry Kubali excavated a Cossack vessel from 1737, which is showing exactly the same butt as this one over here, the connection between the stem and the keel. There will be more comparative items between the Cossack vessel and the Kitten shipwreck. As I mentioned from the very beginning, luck was with me throughout the whole project. I would like to also bring your attention to this. This was the stern post. Originally, when we were excavating, pretty much until the last week of excavation, we have found no traces of the stern post. So I pretty much assumed that that item is lost and cannot be found. One of the last days, I was deep in the stern of the vessel, desperately trying to document the vessel, and there were a group of students who were bored to tears, didn't know what to do with themselves, and I decided to ask them to excavate on the outside amidships of the vessel, mostly to keep them out of my way and keep them busy. You can imagine my consternation when 10 minutes later, one of the gentlemen is coming and tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Come on, you have to see this." I drop my work, I go to see it. The expressions that were floating through my mind are not such as I would like to repeat in a public lecture, but I assume you can imagine. And the gentleman showed me this stern post. Luck all through. sheer dumb luck. We excavated the stern post, pulled it out. It is important for two things. Not only it is giving us the final end vessel and the shape of the vessel in this area, but it is also giving us the height of the water line. This over here, this iron feature is the pintle of the stern post. This is suggesting double-ended vessel, probably with certain curvature to the stern post on the one hand side. It is the length of this iron piece is 225 meters, which means that the top in this type of vessels, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, the top of the pinto usually is right above the waterline or slightly above the waterline. Therefore, we knew, or I was able after that to reconstruct exactly how deep the vessel drew in this area. One last side track on this subject at this point is that as I surfaced 2 hours after everybody else as usual and swam to shore, my entire group of colleagues was waiting for me on shore and said, okay, how did you know that the stern post is going to be under the starboard quarter of the ship? How did you know where to send them? To the present day, I had not admitted that actually I did not. It was pure, sheer dumb luck. Based on the location of the stern post and the flat surface, based on the data that we had acquired during the reconstruction, in the upper part of this slide, you're seeing the actual survival of the vessel. The lower part of the stern post up to about here also survives. The 6th water line is the one that we assume to be the float water line of the vessel. The upper part of the stern post and pretty much the entire stem post from about here upwards is mostly conjectural. In fact, I'm redrawing the site currently under the influence of our
jusqu'à demain, donc les emmène demain à l'aéroport.
Could you please mute your microphone, please?
Thank you. For the curvature of the stem, I had less data than I did for the stern. There were 2 Y-shaped frames that had fallen off the side, but they were in contact with the rest of the wreck. So measuring their angles, I was able to create the lower part of the curve. The upper part, however, as I said, is conjectural. Now, in the light of our discoveries from the Black Sea map, I probably would straighten a little bit the stern post here in the upper part and the same with the stem. They may have been a bit straighter than I have drawn them. The central part of the hull, however, does seem to be consistent with what we're discovering and what so far I have been able to recover from the rest of the vessels. Over the past week, I have started redrawing the Kitten ship in Rhino, specifically as comparative material for the other Ottoman wrecks that we were excavating. And this is a fairly decent view of what the vessel may have looked, just to illustrate the current state of work. Early on in this project, a couple of interesting features emerged. These were the hooks carved. These are the floor timbers on the port side of the ship, or left side for land archaeologists. This is a hypothetical, well, actually not hypothetical, it is a representative sketch of how the floor timbers and the fattacks, that is the upper part that shapes the lower part of the hull of the vessel, would have been connected. In this case, they're connected with a single trunnel and a single iron spike. This is important for a number of reasons. First of all, because it is telling us how the ship was designed. Second of all, it is telling us something about the sequence of raising the frames onto the keel. It's essentially the sequence and therefore the conceptualization of the hull. It is telling us that this was not Grandpa Johnny in the backyard in the winter knocking together a boat to go fishing in the spring. This was done by a professional shipwright who knew essentially what he was doing. And it is a long tradition of building vessels in this sense. The second interesting and important part of this was that such hook scarves had been found elsewhere. The 16th century Ottoman wreck from Yasada, for example, has exactly the same hook scarves. And at the time, I didn't know it. It was only later that I discovered that the Cossack vessel that Dr. Dmitry Kubalia excavated in the Dnieper River has exactly the same scarves. He was very kind and generous in showing me these details in the visit, actually many years after this project was completed as part of the Black Sea map. The second interesting feature in the vessel is that the frames are quite regular. They're regularly spaced, they're regularly dimensioned. This also is implying design of the vessel rather than building by eye, no matter what ship modelers would like to tell you. At the bottom here, you see right at the overlap between the futtocks and the floor timbers. Floor timbers, obviously, they shape the very bottom of the vessel. The futtocks shape the lower part of the hull, the holding area of the hull. This overlap was covered by very heavy bilge stringers that on the outside of the hull are sandwiched by equally thick bilge whales that are notched around the timbers for most of the length of the vessel. That would have added tremendous stiffness to the structure of the vessel. I would have dearly loved to dismantle this part of the vessel to be able to look for carpenter's marks for the assembly of the vessels. Unfortunately, in the struggle between 21st century technology and late 18th century technology, the 18th century won hands down. In other words, we were unable to dismantle it. I have included this slide partially because I think it is a rather cool autograph, quite frankly, but also much more importantly, because it is showing you the regular spacing between the frames and also the cover boards that are sealing off the very bottom of the ship from the sides of the vessel. This sort of open frames on the inside is characteristic of Mediterranean vessels. You're not going to see it in the north, you're not going to see it in the Baltic or on the Atlantic or North Sea coasts, but you certainly do see it in the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Seas, it lasted much longer than anywhere else, as evidenced by the Kitten Shipwreck, for example. Here is a close-up view of the covering boards that are driven between the frames. They are dovetail notched into the foot whaling, heavy planking that covers the overlap between the futtocks and the floor timbers. This sort of covering boards have been discovered in the Caribbean on a number of vessels from mostly Iberian origins, not mostly, but entirely from Iberian origin. So for a while, certain scholars who have worked on these wrecks consider this to be one of the characteristics of Iberian shipbuilding. As the American archaeologist Sarsfield once pointed out, however, the Iberian Peninsula is the westernmost point of the Mediterranean. So now we have evidence that this is really a Mediterranean feature. This is what one of these boards after conservation looks like. It was very specifically for this purpose. It seals off the bottom, it prevents any garbage reaching it there. The sealing planks are also nailed in place. They could not have been removed, which also protects the passages for the water inside and for the pump. Over here, you see the stringers that strengthen the inside of the vessel. And we have 4 surviving on the side. They were grouped into 2 narrower and much thicker stringers, straddled by wider and thinner stringers. But the rest is completely open. There's another close-up view of the same area. I mentioned the outside, the bilge whale, which essentially sandwiches the frames together with the bilge stringer. Both, as you can see, are notched in this area for the frame. This is what really gave the strength of the bow and the stern section of the vessel. When we were excavating the central part around the sister caissons, the mast step, we were able to discover also the opening for the pump of the vessel. Unfortunately, at the time of sinking, this board over here was lying directly on top of the pump, and no pump was found in the vessel. This was not the reason for the sinking, but it could not have made for comfortable sailing. I have absolutely no explanation why a pump would be removed and sealed off, and no provision for getting water out of the hull would have been allowed. Quite curious feature. I mentioned the stanchion floor already. This is one of the bow floor timbers. This down here is the stem. This is one of the frames that allowed me to reconstruct the likely run of the planking in this area, and therefore the shape of the lower part of the stem. I was able to measure this angle over here between the sides of the frame, and I was able to measure the front to lower face angle of the stem. In other places, the hooking, the connection between the floor, the sides of the vessel and the floor timbers are looking different. Not all the frames are hook scarfed. Only the central part of the hull is hook scarfed, about half the length of the vessel. The rest are in any old way connected. I mentioned another system of strengthening the central part where the mast and therefore all the pressure from the rig of the vessel would have been. Here you can see it. These are the actual futtocks, these are the frames, but between them are driven timbers, solid timbers that have no other structural connection with the hull except to stiffen the distance between. This would have added to the stiffness. It probably has done little else for the structure of the vessel. They certainly were not part of the design process, and they are only between the futtocks, nowhere else in the vessel. In one of the places where we see connection between the top timbers and the futtocks, they were fastened fore and aft with iron bolts. In this place, you see that the previous futtock is actually notched in order to drive the iron fasten. This is telling us something about the sequence of construction. It means that the floor timbers and the futtocks were connected to each other before their raising on the keel. But the upper part of the vessel, the top timbers, the superstructure of the vessel, was added only after the planking had reached this stage and the new timbers were added. And in order to make the connection, they had to notch among the other timbers. An interesting feature, to be sure. So this is the part that is surviving with some interesting structural timbers that supported the otherwise barely connected stern post to the rest of the vessel. Being able to record quite a few of the frames and suggested to me, of course, attempt to reconstruct or reverse engineer the design feature of the vessel. I was able to determine that all our frames were cut to exactly the same pattern. The only thing that is changing is the rising and the narrowing, or that is to say how close to the center line these are and how high above the keels and or above the keel rather, these patterns were mounted. This is a process known as hull molding. I was able to determine that the forwardmost frame, which was pre-designed and pre-assembled with the floor timber, was 37 centimeters narrower than was its midship sister. I was able to determine this position for a number of frames, both forward and aft. Based on this, I used the traditional Mediterranean way of controlling this narrowing by constructing a mezzaluna, which of course means half moon or half circle. This is probably not the right place to explain exactly how this works, but essentially the maximum diameter that you see is the greatest narrowing in comparison with the central midship frame. The same was calculated for the rising of the vessel. It was determined that a mezzaluna does not work there. However, mezzarola, which Kostas Damianidis recorded in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek islands, being used as late as the 1950s, 60s, and even up to the 70s, a mezzarola, however, does provide a curve that seems to be matching what we see on the bottom. Before I go too far into claiming that this is exactly how they determine the rising of the frames and therefore the fore and aft orientation of the vessel, I should point out that exactly the same result can be achieved by simply hanging a piece of string loosely. It would have provided precisely the same thing. I already addressed the pump opening. I'll return to it in a moment. But the buttresses and the support system of the sister caissons and the single large mast step. The very length of the mast step, the very orientation of this implied two things. First of all, that the vessel most likely was a lateen-rigged ship, because lateen-rigged masts usually have long steps. The second thing that suggested a lateen rig was being able to determine just how far forward the mast leaned. That is because it was visible on the beam that I showed you earlier in the presentation. That had markings from the rubbing of the mast into the upper edge at an angle. We discovered on the site a treble and a double sheave block. Unfortunately, the treble block sheave was in such terrible state that it was not possible to recover for conservation, but we were able to recover the double sheave block. And over here, you can even see repairs to it. Some rope was surviving inside it. You can see the sheaves. This is clearly part of the halyard mechanism for the yard. But what really told us that we are dealing with a lateen rather than a sprit, Sakoleva type of rig or square rig are these toggles. We recovered 7 of them. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, a big mistake, and that I claim credit for this error. I did not make sure that we had recovered. I believe we had recovered 2 of them. In reality, all of them had been repaired on the site. The fault lies entirely with me because it is the project director's obligation to make sure that everything is as it should be. So mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. It consists of 3 iron bar links ending up with a hook on one end and with a wooden cross T-shaped piece. These are known as toggles, and they are used in setting up the shrouds for lateen yards. They are the system of quick release, if you will. When you're operating a lateen-rigged vessel like this, when you are on the starboard tack, the starboard or right-hand side shrouds are set up and tightened with block and tackles here, and they are attached to these toggles. But on the lee side, on the opposite side from the wind, the shrouds are removed so that the sail can bellow out and can take its shape. No other rig uses this sort of toggles, and this is characteristic of the Mediterranean. So this was one of the strongest evidences that we're dealing with a lateen rig. Among the finds inside the vessel, even though for me the greatest interest was the how, and I believe that this is the biggest contribution that the Kitten Shipwreck has done. Of course, the collection of artifacts was important and interesting. Over here, you see a large group of brooms. We recovered 9 or 10 brooms with possibly remnants surviving of up to 11 or 12. We seem to be finding remnants of handles for more brooms. Of course, it is perfectly possible that the crew of the vessel suffered from maniacal passion for cleanliness. But in the light of some contemporary observers who sailed on Ottoman vessels in this period, this seems to be less likely explanation. This sort of brooms, of course, are used in charcoal burning. I'll return to this in a moment in the concluding remarks on the right chair. The Kitten Shipwreck also provided one of the largest collections, fairly closely datable collection of copper vessels. And here you see drawings done by my friend and colleague, Władysław Todorov, better known among Bulgarian archaeologists as Vlado the Smoking Pipe, for rather obvious reasons. In a moment, I will return to that. I would like to bring your attention to only 2 items that are of some significant interest. There was a bell, simple shepherd's bell. In the stern cabin, we discovered the complete skeleton of a small goat, a kid. As one of my Bulgarian colleagues who's dived and discovered it, the one day we raised the bell, and the following day he came out of his dive, looked at me and said, "Well, boss, I discovered the legal owner of the bell that we recovered yesterday. He's still lying in the stern cabin. And the other one, of course, is the brazier over here. This is a photograph of the copper brazier. Similar ones, a similar brazier, very similar to this one, actually is displayed in the Iskra Historical Museum in Kazanluk. And I am very grateful to my colleague, Meglena Purvin, for showing me that item there. Another interesting feature is this big bowl for water. This is the lid that went with it. It would have lied right here in the lip. And this was the brick that would have stood on top of it. Both items are now on display in the Kitten exhibit, except the brick, which the last time I saw it was when we submitted it to the laboratory of Professor Inkova in Sofia for Conservation. Ever since, I have heard absolutely nothing about the fate of the artifact and have not been able to establish where it is currently located. A large number of pottery jugs with pinched mouths, figure 8 shaped mouths, were discovered both back in the 1980s and also by our expedition. They differ in size. Significant numbers of them are with green lead glaze. Parallels to these exist all over the coast. The Bulgarian archaeologist has before suggested that as they are found only along the coast, they are likely to be seafaring modification of water-carrying jugs because they prevent water from spilling out of them so easily. I suspect that the jury is still out on this one. Among the other artifacts was a perfectly well-preserved plate from Çanakkale dated to the second half of the 18th century, an unidentified source, that is to say, coffee cup. We were unable to, or rather I was unable to determine where it was manufactured, but Lüleburgaz is one possibility, certainly. An interesting collection of smoking paraphernalia came from the site. Interesting collection because besides the smoking pipes, which already have been published as a matter of fact, 2 mouthpieces and 1 stem were discovered. Stems are a rare find for this sort of paraphernalia. There are a number of original 19th century stems surviving in Bulgaria. There are 3 originals surviving in the Abenaki Museum in Athens. And as far as I'm aware, these are the only originals surviving, plus now the Kitten Shipwreck example. In the early 19th century, such stems could reach up to 4 meters length. This one is meagerly 70 centimeters. On the right, I have represented 2 illustrations by Władysław Todorov of stamps found on the smoking pipes. He has identified this as possible, well, he read them as Shishman, which possibly is the family name that still exists in Turkey, according to him. A closer view of this amber mouthpiece was found together with, this is a cherry stick, which the stem was made, with a very narrow copper band that was silver plated originally. A second stem, a second mouthpiece without a stem was also found on the site, very close, in close proximity to these 2, but this mouthpiece does not match the stem, only the amber piece does. An interesting collection of spoons emerged from the wreck also, with the ones that Dr. Porozhanov, or rather Professor Porozhanov, discovered back in the 1980s. This is giving us a total of 18 individual spoons. So this is likely to be close to the number of people that traveled aboard the vessel when she was lost. A similar scoop to this one is used probably for grain, and a very practically identical scoop was found in Matagorda Bay on the wreck of La Salle ships from 1684. A small barrel was discovered also in the only cabin that was discernible on the vessel. Unfortunately, sieving did not yield any information on what could possibly have been carried in it. Naturally, all good Bulgarians are joking that it was rakia, the local brandy. Pure poison as far as I am concerned. An interesting feature that we discovered were fragments that we somewhat tentatively have identified as parts of an iconostas. They are carved in different styles, but they are very close parallels of these elements, these decorative elements in different 17th, 18th century churches in Bulgaria. The only part that was gilded or retained evidence for gilding was this one. These are the two sides of it. It is one piece, as you can see. It has remnants of a hinge at one end and probably was either a diptych or probably a triptych once upon a time. This, together with a pig skin that was discovered by Professor Porozhanov in the 1980s, are implying that the vessel was in Christian hands at the time of sinking. Some personal items were found aboard the ever-present combs, and this is a shape that has not changed really since ancient times all the way to the early 20th century. The wider space comes for the hair, the closer spaced teeth for fighting lice. Practically identical ones are coming from any number of wrecks that you can think of, including the Mary Rose. 2 ear rings, decorative pins came out, and a few shoes, actually 4 shoes, here only 3 are represented, partially preserved, came from the stern cabin. But one of them is particularly interesting because it is the sole of a very much smaller, a child's shoe. This is implying that there was only at least one child aboard, quite possibly that was part of the family of the captain of the vessel. It is known from records that usually the families travel with the captain. 2 ink pots were found in the joint INA CUA, or Center for Underwater Archaeology expedition, but Professor Porozhanov has reported another 2 bronze ink pots from the 1980s that unfortunately could no longer be found at the time when I became involved with the project. They may be somewhere in the Suzopol Museum. I don't know. The glass bottle on the left is surface find that we discovered the very first season, so its provenience is uncertain. It may or may not be connected with our wreck, may be coming from any of the other 3-4 wrecks that are known in the bay. This cup was also found. It is glass cup. It was found in the upper parts of the wreck, but in fairly reasonably secure context. I'm saying this with some hesitation because one of the copper kettles that we found on the site, amidships, that I briefly showed earlier, when we excavated it, inside it, we found an early Bronze Age oil lamp. So how are you to persuade students just how important it is to record carefully everything that is found and how important stratigraphy is? The first indication of dating for the vessel, I attempted, of course, to establish a dendrochronological date for the site, and unfortunately, by now late, I believe, Peter Cunningham told me that he can give me any day that I choose. The timbers can be made to match pretty much any curve for the later 18th century in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it had to be artifacts. Though the majority of the smoking pipes, the pottery seemed to fit best middle to second half of the 18th century. It was up to these tokens and a single more or less readable coin to give us a slightly narrower time frame. The plus ultra sign over here is, of course, the logo of Karol V of the Holy Roman Empire, mid-16th century, but it was used regularly by Ernst Ludwig Zygmunt Lauer, whose name is inscribed over here on the opposite side of the jeton or token. It is essentially an accounting token. As it says here, it says RPF, which is Rechem Pfennig. It was struck by Lauer, who was born in 1762, probably started work around 1783 and was dead by 1833. We are not quite sure around what date he stopped working, but probably around 1820 or thereabouts. The other jeton was struck by Johann Christian Reich, and on one side it says REPF, which is Rechem Pfennig, and Fetsit by Christian Reich. On the other side, it says mit Glück, German with luck. He was born in 1740 and died in 1814. It appears to have started his shop around the year 1762, and by the year 1800, by the early 1800s, he has retired. He had retired from business. This is sort of given us the break in which our vessel is likely to have sunk. The coin has previously been reported as most likely coming from the reign of Sultan Selim III. The Tugr has been identified by João Polak as Selim III. More recent reading by a Bulgarian numismat is suggesting that it may actually be earlier than this and may be Sultan Mustafa III, who reigned between 1757 and 1774. At any rate, all the material that we are finding is consistent with sinking in the late 18th century, probably no later than the Napoleonic period in the early 19th century, because we do not have any later datable material. Of all the artifacts, this is to me the most interesting group, and I will explain in just a moment why. On the left, we see a perfectly simple, normal sounding lead that was used for sounding the depths. It is conventional, it is to be used in coastal navigation. It is something that you would expect to find on any ship, and it was found in the stern cabin of the vessel. That was not a surprising find at all. Delightful to me, but not a surprising part. These elements, however, are quite surprising. They were found in the bow of the vessel, not where you would expect the officers and the competent navigators to have been. This is a mirror from the index arm of a navigational instrument, either an octant or a sextant. It is hard to tell, both would have used very similar. The frame itself has not survived, which suggests a wooden frame, and therefore an octant is more probable. On the other hand, this octant would have had also an ocular. The tube of the ocular was made out of papier-mâché, and only the mush was left when we discovered the site. 2 such rims and 2 lenses were recovered from it. Why do I say that this is the most curious artifact of the whole group? You allow me to quote a few contemporary travelers and observers, what they had to say about navigation within the Ottoman Empire. And they are speaking specifically of Greek sailors who reputably were the greatest sailors within the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, the rest of the world begged to differ. For example, the artist Antoine Laurent Castellan mentioned that there is no order, there is no discipline, there is no cooperation even among the officers aboard Ottoman vessels in this period. That orders contradicted each other, and that not one of the crew on the ship in which he sailed could use a compass, let alone anything more complicated than this. Edward Clark, for example, reported that no compasses, no charts, no navigational equipment, no astronavigation was practiced by sailors in this area. At the moment, I'm being diplomatic, the actual quotations vary between hilarious and farcical in their descriptions, but they are coming from English speaking, they're coming from French speaking, they're coming from German speaking sources. Therefore, they're likely to be representative. Eliot also describes the fact that not only compasses are rarely used in this area, but local sailors were not even aware fully of variation of the compass. So, If that is the case, if none of the observers has ever seen compasses and charts in use, let alone anything more sophisticated, what is an octant or a sextant doing on a Black Sea coastal vessel that likely sailed between the Bulgarian ports and Istanbul? This is a route that actually does not require any sophisticated navigation. You can always blunder your way into it. Astronavigation is not needed. Nothing more complicated than compass and the sounding lead are in fact needed. So why is this there? I have no good explanation. If this is any indication at all, the mirror matches English measurements, English imperial measurements. This does not necessarily mean that it was an English manufactured instrument, but it is most likely. Does this mean that there was a Westerner aboard the vessel? Possibly. In the early 19th century, we know of at least a couple of expeditions organized both by the French Navy and by the British Navy surveying that area of the coast. The British were looking for sources of timber, which they reported to be growing all the way down to the beach line along what is today Bulgaria. The French had an even more ambitious idea. The Minister of the French Navy suggested to Napoleon building an entire fleet in the Black Sea, training for 2 to 3 years until their crews are absolutely proficient before exiting into the Mediterranean to challenge British supremacy. Nothing came out of this idea, but we do know that also French naval officers were, well, not to put too fine a word to it, spying along the coast. The jury is still out on this. One beautiful day, I do hope to have the opportunity to go carefully through the war archives in Kew and see if I can find any evidence for presence of British officers along the coast. But that seems to be one possible explanation for the presence of an instrument that not only is not necessary for navigation in the area, but most likely was completely unknown to the local seafarers. And of course, the interesting question now is, how does this Kitten shipwreck match what we know of Ottoman seafaring? I'm preaching to the choir at the moment by pointing out that archaeology loves repetitiveness. Archaeology loves patterns and does not like exceptions. So over here, I have plotted a few of the Ottoman period wrecks, and really a few of the many that we discovered during the Black Sea map project with. I will go quickly through only a few of them because the process of studying them is just beginning. Some of the wrecks were in really bad state of preservation, especially the ones that are in shallower waters and that are within the reach of the fishing trawlers from Sozopol. Of course, bottom trawling is strictly forbidden in Bulgaria, which inevitably means that they are practicing it all the time. One of the more interesting wrecks is a vessel that originally we identified as a rowing vessel. Subsequently, I came to the conclusion that this is actually a sailing ship, quite a narrow one, but it is a sailing ship that carried timber right under the deck beams over here at Yusrai. Look at these fore and aft pieces of timber. This probably would have been en route to Istanbul. Another of the vessels, surprisingly well preserved, considering that it is at only 95 meters depth, is a two-masted ship with straighter stem and straight stern post in the act, with an interesting structure right over the main cargo catch of the vessel. Over here you see the grapnel type anchor associated with the ship, and right over here it is visible. This structure, initially we hypothesized that it may be the frames or the skeleton of a dinghy boat on top of the vessel. Subsequently, it became clear that it cannot be. There is no narrowing, no rising in the frames. This is simply the hatch cover, quite different from Western style covers. Probably canvas or hides would have been stretched over it to protect the cargo in the hold. It is a different view of the same vessel with the broken mast line across. Pieces of the rigging are still present, and for this I thank Dr. Dragomir Grbo, because he's the one who provided me with these images from an icon that he discovered in Bulgaria. Very likely, the vessel that I just showed you had a rig very similar to this one. As you see, the foremast and the mainmast are well represented here. This one, I believe, dates to the early 19th century, if I remember correctly what Dr. Gerbov has told me. Another vessel that shows exactly the same style of hatch is proving that this is not an oddball. This is fairly well, frequently used style of covering the site. The site plan over here is a drawing by Dr. Gerbov, and this is really his signature style of site plans. When I grow up, I will learn how to do the same style of site plans. Obviously, there is a lot of growing to be done still. Another of the vessels with the bits protruding from the bottom, the stem over here. And as you see, this is one of the reasons why I'm redrawing the Kitten Shipwreck, because most of our vessels have much more gradual curvature to the stem in comparison with what I had drawn and what was visible on the icon. This actually is the bits into which the bowsprit of the vessel butted and was connected. Probably the most interesting of the Ottoman period, or the most curious, is this site. You see the side plan, you see the remnants of the mast, a very long open hatch, actually quite similar to the hatches on our Roman and Byzantine wreck site. Here is a top view of the site as it was reconstructed. The reason that I say that it is among the most interesting is because it is heavily decorated. It has carvings on the support for the sprit down here. It had carvings along the quarterdeck. It had carvings along the head of the rudder, which is still in place, and also the tiller of the vessel, which is lying to the side. We nicknamed it the flower wreck because most of the carving decorations, as you can see over here on the tiller, on the bottom of the tiller, are in the shape of flowers. If you're wondering what these mop-like things are, these are coils of rope that are still surviving as the bosun belayed them before the ship was lost. This is a view from the stern with the stern post. As you can see, the upper part is quite straight, and this is the rudder still in place. This style of wrecks, we actually, with all the due veneration for the past and for our ancestors and for the people who lost their lives in the shipwrecks, we nicknamed it the IKEA wrecks. All the bits and pieces are there, but you have to assemble them yourselves. As you can see over here is all the planking that has fallen down. This stick here is probably the topmast. And it has fallen upside down. Quite interesting feature. Another of the wrecks, another two-master. All of them have essentially the same shape. You can see the family resemblance between all of these vessels, and yet each of them has something slightly different from the other one, just to demonstrate the possible variations within the general class of vessels. Fairly straight sides, not too complicated the shape. All of these vessels are quite small, as a matter of fact. Virtually none are larger than 20 meters. Most of them are in the 16 to 18 meter length. They vary in rig. Some of them are single masters, some are two masters. This one I have included in because this is the first time that we're seeing direct physical evidence for the doubling, for the extension of the mast. This here is the top mast, this is the lower mast. We have no previous knowledge of how this was done on Ottoman vessels. As far as I'm aware, there are no treatises surviving giving us the proportion of rigs for Ottoman vessels either. So this is where our main contribution is going to be. Interestingly, while in Western tradition ships, the top mast is going to be forward of the mast. On this Ottoman and a number of other Ottoman vessels, the top mast is behind the head of the lower mast. Quite interesting. Also, the three bands, the three mast heads or mast caps that are holding the two sticks together are quite interesting. In a Western style vessel, there will be only two cross trees, not three. And of course, you see the long bowsprit over here, you see the stern post and part of the stem. This wreck specifically I have included because of the surviving capstan. It is a crab-style capstan. It is quite crude. It was carved from a single tree trunk. Not even whelps were added to it. It is intact, just carved from a single piece. It has a major wide and very thick king's plank in the central part of the deck structure that framed one of the hatches, actually two of the hatches. Over here is the location of the capstan. Here we see the stern superstructure of the vessel. Let's call it a quarter deck for a lack of a better term. Two vessels had a capstan. That one was the cruder one, and this one had a very clearly distinguished forecastle, stern castle. You can see the tiller is still on top of the rudder. A thicker central king's plank, just like the previous vessel. You see the triple secure and the top mast to the lower mast. The interesting feature, of course, is the much more complicated capstan shown on this, and also the fact that the main cargo hatch is offset to the starboard side of the vessel. That we have not seen on any other vessels. These are detail of the same vessel. You see the balustrade at the quarter deck of the vessel. This is the rudder over here, still in place. This is the stern post, and a closer view of the capstan, in this case with whelps. And here is a longitudinal view of the vessel. Another interesting vessel that Dr. Gerbov and I are deeply interested in. This is one of few armed ships. All the other armed ships fall into the hands of Dr. Gerbov. This one is likely dating to the 18th century, and it had at least 6 guns because we were able to determine a minimum number of 3 gun ports on the side of the vessel. Over here you see the pump still standing in position, the mainmast, tentatively identified as mainmast, and the foremast over here with the bowsprit. 4 anchors, 3 Admiralty style, 1 grapnel style, a very short quarter deck, probably double-ended vessel that is just split open at the moment. There are many ways that humanity has devised of attempting to keep a ship in place, but one of the least successful, second only to stone anchors, is the grapnel anchor. That thing drags on the drop of a pin. You see the lower part of the bowsprit with a cleat over here and the belaying pin rack right under it, together with some of the bits. The stock of the anchor with the anchor ring. Over here you can see one of the gun ports, another one is over here, and there is a third one over here. Possibly a 4th one is over here, though there is not quite enough room for manipulating. Besides the vessels, and I promise you that this is the end, I have about 3 slides left. This is coming to the end. We discovered a large group, close to 16, if I remember correctly, open boats. All of them are at more than 20 nautical miles out seawards from the shore. In other words, they would not have been able to see land from their location. All of them are open. All of them are rowing and sailing vessels. Practically all of them were 2-masted vessels. They're very similar in shape. They're very similar in construction features. They're similar in overall dimensions. When we first discovered this group, they all sank within approximately nautical mile of each other. So when we originally discovered them, it appeared that they sank in a single event. Naturally, we started looking through the historical records, thinking what that event could possibly be. The only reasonable explanation were the Cossack raids of the late 16th and throughout the 17th century. It pretty much was summer vacation for Cossacks from Zaporizhia, from the Zaporizhian Sich, or Sich actually, coming along and raiding along the Western Black Sea shore. And that is the point where I contacted, through a mutual acquaintance, friend, I contacted Dr. Dmitry Kubalia, a famous maritime archaeologist from Ukraine who had raised and studied Cossack vessels. I had the very great privilege of meeting him, and looking at some of the material that he had discovered, trying to see if there is a connection between these boats and the material that he had discovered and his colleagues had raised and is now on display in Zaporizhzhia. He was kind enough to accept our invitation to join us for the final season Black Sea map to have a look at these boats. And although I had very much hoped that we had discovered Cossack Chaikas, the famous Cossack raiding vessels, his conclusion was that more likely these are the Ottoman response to the Cossack menace in the Black Sea. There are a few common features that all of the boats are showing. This is this bulkhead at the very front end. The actual shape differs slightly, the carvings differ slightly, but they all, or almost all of them, have one such bulkhead in the bow area over here. And they are connected with the rigging of the vessel because practically all of them have lines still wrapped around them. Most of the vessels have their main masts, and some of them, even the foremasts, laid down along the thwarts, which suggests that they were running in front of the storm at the time of the sinking. This is probably the most interesting, most elaborately carved of them. The transom board, the taffrail of the boat, has, again, flower carvings on them, flower elements. So this also strengthens Dr. Kubali's belief that these are the Ottoman reply to the Cossacks. In case you were wondering what these strange curly things are, at first we with delight thought that this is pottery, and finally we'll be able to determine, to date the boat and to determine where it originated. As we raised them, one of these pieces, it proved to be plastic grocery store bag, 1970s vintage, Bulgar plot. All of these are plastic sea bags that had somehow found their way inside the boat. The boat is not contemporary with them. However, C14 has suggested dates to the middle of the 17th century. Another of the vessels here, you can see the same type of bulkhead, slightly differently shaped, but in the same location, same type. And you can even see the foremast is still standing while the rest of the rig is taken down. This is a typical feature when you are running in front of a heavy storm and doing your best to survive. In this case, unsuccessfully. Over here, another such bulkhead from the stem of the vessel. I think that this is, if you have gotten the picture of what I'm trying to say, this is the same style of boats. They're boats that sank in the same event and theoretically should be able to track the event through Ottoman records. For this, I probably will need to contact the Ottoman. Trying to identify the vessels, I found Guéraud de Pas, the French artist, who published a series of drawings in the around 1708, 1709, that is showing exactly the same style of boat. You can see over here the bulkhead that I've been showing you for the last couple of slides. And it is described as caïque de galère, in other words, and I beg pardon for my butchering of the French language. But essentially it is a galley boat. I was quite surprised not long ago. I discovered in a PhD candidate's proposal that the PhD candidate suggested that the main contribution of that dissertation was identifying our boats with this boat, when it was me who gave the image to the person in the first place. Oh well. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm finally bringing this overly long lecture to a conclusion. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Ktten Shipwreck for allowing me to work on this wreck and for his friendship and for his partnership on it. I would like to thank the Center for Underwater Archaeology and, of course, first and foremost, Mr. John Delapa and RPM Nautical Foundation, who made the project possible through their generous funding of it and their confidence in me. I'm grateful to Dr. Kalin Dimitrov, to Evelina Petkova, to Dr. Nadim Prakuku, whom I had the pleasure of meeting actually during the excavation of the Kitten Shipwreck, and of course my colleagues, all my colleagues from the Black Sea map, and particularly Dr. Dragomir Gerbov, who after all made this lecture possible. Thank you ever so much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kroum Batchvarov, for this fascinating and informative talk. The Kitten Shipwreck excavation is clearly quite significant for nautical archaeology altogether, but it's also a milestone in Bulgarian archaeology. I know to all attendees of this lecture that an archaeological exhibition devoted to this site has been prepared and is currently on display in the township of Kitten on the southern Bulgarian Black Sea coast. I certainly recommend visiting it to those who are interested. And now let me begin with the Q&A session. Again, I'm asking everyone to post their questions in the group chat, and I see one question is already there. This is Carol Schneider. How deep was the Kitten wreck?
When we began excavating, the site itself is about 7.5 meters deep. By the time we were done excavating the stern of the vessel, we were another 3 meters deep into the bottom. So the grand total had become 11 meters at that location. The vessel is more than 15 degrees down by the stern. I believe that we can say something about the way the ship was lost. It is pointing north-northeast by north, which is the dominant direction of storms in the area during the summer months or the navigational months. The vessel's stem is eroded, but it is not broken. Nothing in the bow is destroyed. Nothing is wrecked. It was just eroded and eaten up by Teredo navalis. But the stern is completely smashed to pieces. The frames there are twisted and broken. The stern post, as I told you earlier, was thrown under the side. The only possible explanation for this is that the ship was a tanker. The storm picked it up. This actually, the wreck is within the surf zone. So picked it up and smashed its stern down into the bottom of the sea, into the shallow bottom of the bay. And that is how she was buried. It clearly happened suddenly and quickly because of the presence of the goat in the stern case, in the stern cabin. And yes, thank you. I have heard all the goat jokes that you can come up with.
Another question by Carol Schneider. Any idea as to the wood that was used in the Kitten shipwreck?
Yes, the wood was identified. It is entirely oak. We had absolutely no other species except oak. It was identified as the species that popularly is known as Turkish oak, but basically is Eastern Mediterranean. It is a type that grows within all of Bulgaria and significant parts of Anatolia also. The only timber that was different were the pieces from the iconostas. They are mostly from plantain.
Fantastic. Next question from Carol is, any idea as to the shipyard where the Kitten shipwreck was constructed?
No, none at all. It clearly is Ottoman. Considering the late date of the vessel, this style of construction was long abandoned in the western part of the Mediterranean. So this clearly is coming within Ottoman context, Ottoman imperial context, but where exactly it is impossible to say. We can guesstimate because there were extensive shipbuilding facilities in what is today Nessebar, or Mesembria. Varna was known for its shipbuilding. Around present-day Ravda, shipbuilding was practiced. And of course, farther south along the coast. So it can be from within the Ottoman shores of, within the Turkish, present-day Turkish shores. It could be from there, but equally easily, it can be within what is today Bulgaria. I am guessing that it is a local vessel, locally built vessel.
Fantastic.
I should also point out that she is quite a bit bigger than most of the vessels that the Black Sea map discovered.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Next question, Jagoda Ziomska. What has influenced such good preservation of wood in the Kitten shipwreck?
The fact that it is at the mouth of the Karagach River, and the sedimentation. Because of the way the stern is smashed, the ship sank very quickly down by the stern and was filled up with mud. The part of the vessel that was not immediately buried in the mud, the port side of the ship, no longer exists, although it is possible that there are fragments of it in near vicinity. We subsequently saw some evidence that there is more timber surviving to port, but that is the explanation. It was buried very quickly into the mud, and that saved it. Incidentally, I should point out that the oak posts of the early Bronze Age settlement, and here Doctors Gerbov and Prakuku can correct me since they know the site far better than I do, but those timbers are in outstanding state of preservation. They're so strong, in fact, that the captain of the COA boat, Petr Petrov, seriously considered mooring the boat to the early Bronze Age corner posts. As you can imagine, certain colleagues, among them the late Kristina Angilova, slightly objected to that idea.
Absolutely, yes. I guess a lot of it has to do with the low levels of salinity in this particular area in the Black Sea also, that sort of prohibits Tyrannodon from impacting timbers so much. Thank you for this one, Kroum.
The protruding timbers were heavily damaged by Tyrannodon actually. It was only in my humble opinion, it is the mud that really saved so much of the wreck.
Right. Yes, gotcha. Thank you. A question by a person whose name I see only as Hope. Thank you for your presentation. How did you retrieve the heavier artifacts from the shipwreck?
None of the artifacts were that heavy, as a matter of fact. The only heavy timber that we had to move was the beam that I showed you earlier, and that one we did not retrieve. It is reburied inside the side, but we lifted it with lifting bag, air bag.
Fantastic.
The rest of the artifacts we cushioned with sandbags and other softening material, put them in trays or in Tupperware style, and recover them that way to protect them.
Thank you. A question from Sophia B. Do you have any upcoming projects soon you're excited about?
Yes, I'm looking forward to at least two projects that I'm hoping, COVID permitting, to take place in the coming season, 2022. One is with my colleagues, Dr. Nadim Prakuku and Dr. Dragomir Gerbov in the Black Sea. The other one is I was invited by Professor Johan Rönnby of Maris, or the Södertörn University in Stockholm, to go dive on a site with him again. So these are the two projects that I'm most keen on participating. And very recently, it has become apparent that we are likely to return also to Tobago in the near future, probably in 2023.
Quite a lot going on. Fantastic. Another question by Hope.
No rest for the wicked.
Yes. Does being underwater impact the efficacy of the carbon-14 dating? And if so, has this posed a challenge to dating the shipwrecks in this way?
Yes. I frequently describe carbon-14 in maritime context as black magic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In my humble opinion, there are way too many ways in which a C14 date can be spoiled, can be compromised from maritime context. No, I cannot at the moment quantify this or give reference to literature, but for anything from the post-medieval period, the best way to date an archaeological site from shipwreck site is through dendrochronology. If you're very fortunate, dendrochronology can give you not only the year, but also the month in which a timber was cut. It can give you it can source the timber. It can tell you exactly where it grew, in what conditions, when it grew. I believe in dendrochronology the way the Midwesterner in the United States believes in biblical creationism. Without a pot of evidence that has ever worked for me, I still believe in it. Not one of the sites on which I have worked has ever yielded me a date. Not Tobago, not the Kitten Shipwreck. But I still believe that this is the best way. Of course, you have to have the master curve, you have to have more than 100 rings, etc. C14 from the post-medieval period, I would always take with a grain of salt and only trust it if it is connected with something else. Let's face it, for the ancient world, it is great, nice and dandy. But if we are looking at a 19th century wreck and C14 gives you plus minus 100 or 90 years, it's making a hell of a lot of difference, much more significant difference than for older periods.
Absolutely. I guess also the coins that you have in the accounting tokens in the Kitten Shipwreck are a really, really good sort of terminus postquem for the archaeological site. Another question from Carol Schneider. Any idea as to how many crew was on the Kitten Shipwreck?
As a matter of fact, yes, or at least I have a hypothesis. I have suggested we have a grand total of 18 spoons that were recovered from the vessel. Traditionally in the Balkans, and in some places to the present day in the rural mountain areas, in the villages, it is quite common for people to eat from the same pot, cooking pot, but each would have their separate spoon. So I am fairly confident that the number of spoons we found on the Kitten Shipwreck is consistent with the number of people that were aboard. How many of them were crew and how many were family? For example, we have evidence for female presence aboard and we have evidence for a child presence aboard. The earrings, decorative buttons that are characteristic of female folk costume, but not necessarily male one. The earrings I also mentioned already. The child shoe, this is giving us already a minimum of 2 people that were aboard and were eating, consuming victuals, but were not actually part of the crew. This cuts down the number of the crew to 16. If we assume that another one may have been the owner of the sextant octant, it is likely that the crew, in fact, was more like a dozen to 15 people. Latin rigged vessels are renowned for their excessive labor intensiveness, because on each tack, every time that you change the orientation of the vessel in comparison with the wind, you have to shift the yard and the sail to the other side of the mast. It always has to be away from the wind, on the leeward side of the mast. And you have to reset the rig at the same time, preferably doing it quickly and simultaneously, lest you get dismasted. So Latin riggers in comparison with square riggers or any other type of vessel actually have much larger crews per tonnage. And 15, 16 men would not have been too excessive, especially if you consider that the vessel likely displaced around 160 tons fully loaded, which was a rather lengthy answer to a simple, straightforward question. I beg your pardon for it.
That was a great answer, I think. Another question from Carol. Any idea of the origin of copper vessels recovered from the Kitten wreck? Where were they manufactured?
Excellent question. Probably within the Balkans, probably within what is today Bulgaria. The closest parallels that I have found so far are coming from the Pod-Balkan, Karlovo, Kalvofer, that Kazanluk, that area of Bulgaria, which was renowned as a copper working center. Some maybe coming from the Rhodope mountain area. Before being too confident in this, I should point out that broadly similar material was recovered also from the Sadana island wreck in the Red Sea, which was excavated by Cheryl Ward in the 80s, if I remember correctly, late 80s or early 90s. And many of the vessels are very close in shape to them. Unfortunately, the Sedana material is not being published. It was only a subject of a master's thesis. As far as our copper vessels, they are about to be published probably in the first issue of the International Journal of Historical Archaeology for 2022. The article, I just submitted the final corrections of the layout of the article, so it should be coming out.
I am really looking forward to reading that article. A question from Sophia B. Where are the wooden artifacts kept at the moment?
The wooden artifacts, the blocks, well, that pretty much is it. The blocks, the spoons, they are on display in Kitten.
A question by Carol Schneider. Any food or beverage residues identified on site?
No, we looked carefully through this. We have found, of course, we did a pollen analysis, and the pollen analysis identified watermelon present aboard, some grain, but nothing to identify. Oh, well, besides the goat, of course, and some bones. There were some sheep bones and some chicken bones found. However, they were found in the upper levels of the wreck, so I cannot be positive that they really are coming from our ship and are not subsequent deposition. But nothing as far as the actual process of cooking. Neither did we find any means of preparing food. The charcoal burner is unlikely to be the cooking stove of the vessel. Probably cooking was carried out in a sandbox on the upper deck, because we found absolutely no other evidence for it. Neither have we found any positive evidence for cargo. It could have been grain, it could have been timber, or it could have been charcoal. All three were exported from that area.
That's fantastic. The copper brazier actually cannot sustain very high temperatures that are necessary for cooking, right? I mean, they're usually used for heating and for providing heat, aren't they?
Exactly.
And another question by Carol. Any idea of the range of the Kitten shipwreck? For example, how many kilometers per voyage? Or just to paraphrase it, maybe how far the Kitten shipwreck or ship would have sailed in a voyage?
She could have sailed at any distance. That would have depended mostly on where the cargo was destined to. I am assuming that it is a coastal vessel, but it could have sailed across the Black Sea. It really depends at what stage did it sink. If it sank prior to the Russian conquest and destruction of the Tatar Khaganate in Crimea, theoretically it was possible to sail to there. There is no actual restriction as far as the seaworthiness of the ship goes. Granted, a few of the travelers, observers had expressed sometimes quite entertaining ideas of the seafaring capabilities of the local population. So really that would have been the limiting factor rather than the strength of the vessel. She would have been somewhat lousy sailor, but she would have been perfectly capable of crossing the Black Sea. The most regular routes are probably any of the ports on the western shore of the Black Sea and Istanbul. I'm fairly confident the vessel was employed in the supplying of the capital, probably with agricultural products, timber, construction timber, charcoal, that sort of things.
Fantastic, thank you. A question by Hope. Are there any big mysteries left about the Kitten shipwreck that you still want to know? How might you be able to find out?
Yes, that is the presence of the octant, assuming that it is an octant and not a sextant. That is a thing that has been tormenting me for nearly 20 years now. Why was it? What is it doing there? I elaborated on this quite extensively, perhaps way too long, in fact, when I was presenting the material, but this is not an instrument that was As a matter of fact, there is a correspondence between the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte and the Foreign Office in the UK, in which during the Napoleonic Wars, the Home Office is suggesting gifts of sextants and navigation equipment to the Ottoman Navy in order to persuade the Ottoman Empire to switch its allegiance to Great Britain from France, which was the traditional ally of the empire. And the ambassador answers to this exactly with these words. He says, well, most of the navigators for the Ottoman Navy are Greeks, and they're utterly incompetent. They cannot read charts. They do not use charts. They cannot navigate because, fine, we'll give them octants and sextants, but there are no almanacs. There are no charts in use. How is this going to help them? This is entirely impractical. And that idea was dropped. So if this is the case, then clearly it is not a question of just prejudice. They're not bad-mouthing, they're just stating fact. They're trying to figure out how to get the Ottoman Empire on their side, and they cannot figure it out. They want to give them something, but it's not really practical to do it. So if all of this is true, then why are we finding on some small, unimportant, godforsaken coastal trader, we're finding an octant? Note also where we found it. It is found in the bow of the port bow of the vessel. It is not found in the stern cabin, where you would expect the captain navigator to keep his instruments if they were his. So why? And I'm the first one to point out that this is nothing more than absolute guesswork. Call it fiction, call it fantasy, call it whatever you want. The only explanation that I can think of at the moment is that this vessel somehow was connected with the European efforts of gaining information and navigational information for the area, either for the purpose of exploiting the timber supplies or the grain supplies. Let's not forget that the Black Sea area provided most of the grain for the Duke of Wellington's armies in the Peninsular War at the time. That is when the real interest in the Black Sea started in the Western Hemisphere. So that is the truly magical, truly mysterious artifact aboard the vessel, and the one that I would dearly love to know more about. Is it possible to find out? It will be a shot in the darkness. But if ever I have the money and leisure to spend a month roaming the archives at Kew in the United Kingdom, who knows what can be unearthed there.
Yes, that's fantastic. I guess just to put it in a bit more historical context, about the time when the Kitten shipwreck sank, the Black Sea was just sort of being rediscovered by Europeans, wasn't it? The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca was just in 1774. So in the last 2 decades of the 18th century, there was the first European sort of re-emerging in the Black Sea and starting to chart it. And as you say, of course, was celestial navigation, the navigation necessary for the local mariners? The Black Sea is such a small basin, isn't it? The sail from Odessa to Constantinople is about 36 hours. And then crossing the Black Sea from Burgas to Poti in Georgia takes about 4 to 5 days. So yes, they weren't really, and they didn't really need to know celestial navigation. So this is such an interesting and fascinating artifact. I'm so fascinated by it as well. What is it doing there? Maybe that's an agent. Maybe that's a person there.
That's the only explanation I can come up with. I spoke of the Ottoman Empire. This and the fact that even the Navy did not use, just as you said, Drago, it was not necessary. You use something if you have to, if it is needed. But the area of operation of the Ottoman Navy is within a few hours sailing of any coast.
Of course.
So why would you bother to do this if you don't have to? And as you said, for the Black Sea, for a small merchant ship, even more so. You can make your way to, even without compass. We found absolutely no evidence for a compass, for example, on the Kitten shipwreck. Yes. So if you don't have a compass, but you suddenly have octant, that's rather curious.
Yes, absolutely. And, being raised on the Western Black Sea coast, everybody, is thinking about this vast sea that's ahead of you, and, how amazing and unexplored it is, etc., etc. But then when you look at, even 18th century, um, are we all right?
Yeah, I think so.
This was actually a really small basin to navigate. As I was just thinking about the famous battle of Sinop, where the Russian Navy completely annihilated the Ottoman Navy and sparking the Crimean War. The Russians actually, left at night, and by the morning, they were on the other side of the Black Sea. So
it was, of course, unprovoked attack.
Yeah.
In peacetime, but so what's new, basically?
Okay, back to the questions. I think, first of all, we have a comment by Sophia B. She says, this is not a question. I just wanted to say that this talk was absolutely spectacular for me from the perspective of a UK commercial archaeologist. Thank you so much for sharing your research.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind.
And then a question by Hope. Could you do isotope analysis on the goat bones and try to identify where exactly their food sources are from?
Had the bones been in context, in secure context, I probably would have tried to raise the funds to do it. Theoretically, it would have been possible. But all of them were floating on the surface at the bottom. They were not even, we didn't even excavate them. They were just lying on top of it. So with the risk of being less than careful, I strongly suspected the local fast foods, or rather the local restaurants, as being the source of these bones. So no isotope analysis was undertaken on that.
Roger, just to clarify, I think Hope is talking about the goat, the little kid.
Oh, the goat. The bones of the goat remain on the bottom of the vessel. No, we did not undertake any isotope analysis on that.
Roger that. Gotcha.
In retrospect, we probably should have.
I think next comes a comment by Carol Schneider. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles in the Pacific without instruments, chronometers, and charts. English, French accounts, evidence of cultural imperialism. Maybe we would like to clarify this one a little bit further and a little bit later. If Carol wants to clarify the question, that would be great. And then a question by Evelyn Banjakov. Any ideas what was the maximum cargo load capacity of the Kitten ship?
Yes. About 160 tons is the maximum that you could have carried, which is rather large. I mean, the Kitten shipwreck is around 23 meters overall. As I originally reconstructed it, it may have been a little bit longer than this if you straighten the stem and stern posts. This is quite significantly larger than the vessels that the Black Sea map discovered, for example, because all of them are in the vicinity of 16 to 18, 19 meters at the most. Only the flower wreck is a little bit longer, and it's coming short of 20 meters. All documentary evidence, both by Bulgarian scholars and by Ottoman scholars and by French scholars who have written the most about seafaring in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Seas, all agree that Black Sea vessels were very small, from their point of view, very small, and that they rarely exceeded more than 100 tons. That seems to be supported by the archaeological record, what we are discovering so far. But again, we are here reaching something that we discussed a little bit earlier in connection with the navigation system. How much bigger do you need it to be? A vessel, the purpose of building the biggest, the largest thing, this was aspect of communism. It is not aspect of normal human activities. You don't need to be the bigger. You build a vessel that is going to be gainfully employed. And considering that there were no port facilities along the Western Black Sea shore all the way until the very tail end of the 19th century, the truth of the matter is that loading a ship that is much bigger than about 100 tons is going to be a challenge, and it would imply staying in port for economically unreasonable amount of time. None of the trades, none of the cargoes that were carried required larger ship than about 150 tons at the most.
Absolutely, and I guess it's also a matter of access to ports, isn't it? Shallower draft, smaller sides. A question by Dr. Nadim Prakuku. Do you consider the Kitten shipwreck completely excavated?
Ooh, that was a mean hit under the belt, Nadim. Could something else be done with it? Yes, it can. We have acquired all the necessary information, but in an ideal world, I would like to reopen it and do a photogrammetry, more for the purposes of offering the general public a view of what a ship like this would have looked like once upon a time, than because I hope to acquire additional information from photogrammetry. The one part of the vessel that I would dearly have loved to see is to excavate the outside of the vessel on the starboard side. And since we are already in the realms of fantasy, I would have loved to expand our search area on the port side to see if any of the port side of the ship is surviving. Are any of these going to revolutionize our understanding of the Kitten shipwreck? No. Would it be nice to do it? Yeah, absolutely. It'll be a lot of fun to do it. But is it worth organizing a complete expedition and raising funds? Probably not. There probably are better ways that we can use the funding.
Thank you. Carol has sent us a message saying, my comment was in agreement with Dr. Batchvarov. English-French accounts perhaps biased towards Western European navigational technology and minimizing skills of local native sailor. By all means, I think it's like that. What do you think, Kroum?
It's certainly possible. I am very careful in seeing this prejudice because it is universal. And the descriptions that they give ring true, partially through knowledge of the local character, if you will, partially because these are stories that you cannot, why would you make them up? You can say, oh, they're bad navigators, they could not find their way, all of this, all right. But we have other evidence that none of the navigation equipment was used. We do have plentiful. For example, let me quote one of the original sources that I like to quote. William Elliot, a British diplomat who was representative in at the Sublime Port in the later 18th century. He wrote a couple of works, 2 volumes set on the Ottoman Empire in its current situation, and a small, about 60-page brochure specifically on trade in the Black Sea. And yes, you can see prejudice against the local seafarer. For example, he describes shortening sail in a rising storm. He said these people could not shorten sail, so they started throwing sharp pieces of wood at the sail in order to rip it, and that way decrease the pressure on the sail instead of reefing it. This probably is exaggeration. But everything else, from falling asleep while steering, from not using compass, from all the way through the moment things starting going wrong, starting to pray to an icon and dropping the tiller, they may be slightly exaggerated, yes. But the overall level of seamanship, I strongly suspect that probably was not much better than what they described.
I must mention, as now you mentioned, you know, taking out an icon and starting to pray. We now also have physical evidence in that in the icon drawings that icon depictions we saw in Neseber. I refer to the icon you showed where a sprit-rigged vessel is shown where somebody is dipping an icon in the sea, where the Greek inscription above the icon says Saint Nicholas at the tiller, and the icon of Hagia, I think it was Hagia Galini in the water, saves the ship from a storm. So yeah, this is definitely a practice that was common in abundance. A question.
And thank you again for sharing these images with me. I think I mentioned during the lecture it was you who discovered them. I cannot claim any.
It is actually
for that.
It's actually the museum in Nessever, in the UNESCO World Heritage site of Nessever. They pointed me to that particular one. There is a question by Sophia B. Where are you based at the moment? Are you working from the US or Bulgaria?
US. I am a Professor of Maritime Archaeology, Associate Professor of Maritime Archaeology at the University of Connecticut.
Thank you. A question from Kirill Velkovsky. We have marked another 2 ships not far from the place by a side scan this autumn. We know them local divers and we're lucky to scan them. Do you think it is possible to be from the same time? And do you plan, if possible, to excavate them? The whole bottom of the bay is with some parts from ships down. We know this from previous scanning of the area.
I would dearly love to see the scans and the reports in the material that the COA has discovered and has. It is something that certainly Dr. Prahov, Dr. Gerbov, Dr. Dimitrov, and I have been discussing. And well, one cannot escape one's fate. Obviously, I'm fated to be an Ottoman shipwreck specialist. So yes, I certainly would be interested in seeing. It's quite possible. Many of the wrecks probably are from the same period. Of the 3 wrecks, in addition to the Kitten Shipwreck that I have seen in that corner right next to the water breaker, to the wave breaker, 2 of them for sure are approximately the same period. The 3rd one seemed to have double sound frame construction, which would indicate it to be either Western European or a later date. It was a timber carrier, so I suspect that it is Black Sea later, early 20th century Gimea, but the rest of the vessels very likely are from the Ottoman period, yes.
Thank you. Are there any more questions tonight? Well, I guess that was a beautiful and quite lengthy discussions. Thanks to everyone for your interest, and of course, thanks to Dr. Kroum Batchvarov for agreeing to present this lecture for the BEMA seminar. Before we conclude, I would like to advise everybody that our next seminar is going to take place on the 5th of February, 2022, and is going to be led by Dr. Kamen Boyadjiev from the National Archaeological Institute with Museum of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, who is going to acquaint us with the fascinating archaeology of the prehistoric Tel Unatite in southern Bulgaria. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's and today's lecture. We wish and hope to see you soon. Thanks again to Dr. Kroum Batchvarov and to the organizers from the Balkan Heritage Foundation and the New Bulgarian University. Good night.
Thank you ever so much to everybody. Thank you.